Hello, hello. Welcome to Your Home by Design, the podcast where we talk all about our homes and how they affect our health and well-being. Some episodes we delve deep into the research and some we just chat. I'm Nico, an interior designer and researcher passionate about bringing forward the findings so that you can improve your lifestyle and well-being. Grateful to have you. Let's do this. Hello, welcome to today's episode. Today, we're going to talk about antiques and vintage. I'll start by sharing what goes on in our brains when we tell people stories about them and how we view our significant possessions. This one may come as a shock. I'll define the meaning of antique and vintage so you know which is what, and then I'll share a little story of one of my personal favorite antiques. And we'll conclude the episode with some tips on how and where to incorporate them. If you've ever wanted to inject some serious style into your home and you're curious about how to do it with old stuff, this episode is for you. Most antiques and vintage objects come with a story, and we all love a good story. And there is a reason for this. The reason for this is our brains are wired to remember what someone tells us if they use a story. And when we share stories with one another, we produce cortisol in our brains. So when somebody is telling us a story, we're transported to it. We see the details. We can picture it and visualize. We can sense how they're feeling as they're telling us this story. So we remember the details and we produce cortisol. Just sharing stories can strengthen our connection to someone. You know, I'm sure you've been a part of conversations where the person telling you a story is really excited or happy, and you feel excited and happy as they're telling it to you. You know, you also get a glimpse into who they are and what makes them happy, what their interests are. You know, we share information and communicate our values through our stories. So if a story brings you joy, it's good for your brain. It may even cause you to make positive changes in your life. So purchasing something that has a story that you want to share is very valuable. And often when we have a statement piece, something that draws attention in a room that stands out, it's often the thing people will ask about or are interested in. So antiques and vintage can prompt a good story. The other thing is when we have possessions that are significant to us, like antiques that have been passed down or even something that we have simply fallen in love with, you know, these possessions could have more significance than you may know. Let me explain. So there was a study carried out where they wanted to look at how our possessions are viewed as part of ourselves. So I guess kind of like, you know, your cherished painting or piece of furniture is compared to, say, your arm. You know, it's a part of you. Obviously, your arm is attached to you, but so how do we respond to our belongings? So they did this study where they took 160 items and asked the participants to sort them out by self to non-self. And they found, and this is very interesting, that the body and its parts, not surprisingly, scored the highest on the self score. Then it was things like psychological processes, so like how our body and brain work, and personal attributes like generous, hardworking, etc. And then the next highest score was possessions. So this study suggests that our objects are pretty darn important to us, so much so that we view them as part of ourselves, and we project our self-image onto them. Now, we can look at this in a few ways. Probably not the best thing if you're gaining self-worth from your possessions, but let's look at it as a good thing. You gain insight into yourself and your lives. You feel joy in these things and you enjoy being surrounded by them. You can speak about them and their meaning to others, sharing stories, which you know the benefits of. So when we look at incorporating vintage and antique, this becomes more relevant. Often, and as I've mentioned, these sorts of pieces come with a story or could be linked to a story. You know, even if it's not a direct story, like directly related, like it was passed down, there is a story because they have historical reference. So bringing in antiques and vintage should be thought of as an opportunity to add some style, which is great, and interest, and a story. Surround yourself with something you love and cherish. Celebrate craftsmanship because that can be felt, and to get some serious brain boosting effects. Vintage and antique objects really do elevate the design of a space. They have the ability to create a space that stands alone. It's not going to look like a room from a store. It's going to have more personality and more atmosphere. They can connect us to the past and the history, a blend of sort of old world meets new world. And that contrast, I think, is where the magic happens in a room. Beauty of old world juxtaposed to new and fresh things. And I think when you have that, it's the old world, it's the stuff that has a patina that's not perfect that stands out and draws attention. So personally, I love antiques and vintage. I don't just love seeing them in spaces or designing with them, but I really appreciate them personally. And I have one favorite antique. It's sort of the biggest piece that I have. I have vintage kind of objects, but this is sort of that one piece that carries a lot of significance and that really does draw attention in my living room. So this piece has my story, a personal story that I'll share. So when my husband's grandma passed away, who, by the way, was an amazing woman, she had such an incredible story of overcoming and perseverance and going against the odds and fighting through some really challenging things in life. She was an amazing cook. She had a great sense of humor. Sadly, she passed away before we had kids. And that was something that we knew would have brought her so much joy, to see us become parents. So when she passed away, she left us a small inheritance. And it was not long after, I think probably about a year after, that we found out we were pregnant with our first. So one of the things we thought was, would be a really precious way to remember her is if we purchased something special with the inheritance. And we decided to buy an antique and then give it to our daughter. She was our firstborn when she got older. So I looked and tried to work through what would be a piece that she could kind of have in her nursery and then something that she could then grow into and want as an adult. So I landed on this perfect piece, and I thought I could use it for a change table, which was kind of crazy because it's such a beautiful piece that, of course, it's something that should be taken care of. But, we thought, we'd use it for a time as a change table. And then, like I said, we would take it kind of out of her room for a time and then give it to her as she got older. But we bought it from an antique dealer close to where we lived. And we went and saw it in person and we were just amazed by the details and the patina. And there was a bit of a story to it. It came from Paris, France, and it was part of it, came from a really old part of Paris with a lot of history. And there's this stamp on the inside of one of the drawers that sort of indicates all of this information. But, my daughter had this in her room for years. And actually I'll share a picture on my social if you want to check it out. But, so as she got older, we moved it to our living room because it's such a versatile piece. And also, to keep it, like I said, out of her room when she was in that kind of young age of, wear and tear and whatever. But, so it will be one of the first things we give her when she gets her own place. And she basically has no choice in the matter. No, I'm kidding. I just hope I've instilled in her to cherish special things and how it relates to her grandma. It was just such a special purchase because we made an investment into something that we will cherish from a beautiful person. And we love to look at the piece and to think about and to think about grandma and that time of our lives. So it's these things that add meaning and interest into your space. Now I'm not saying you have to introduce things with really big stories. That doesn't have to be the case. You can still purchase things that have a story, and you can even create a story from the experience. So I'll give you an example. Let's say your heritage is Austrian, yet you don't have anything in your home that would suggest that. And let's say you grew up in another country and you don't even know much about the area in Austria that your family came from, and this is where I would say to turn this into an experience. If you're interested, if you think that this is something that could excite you and that you would really appreciate having that heritage in your home, do some digging to find out more about the area your family was from. Look into the kind of art or furniture you would have seen during that time. Maybe even something that might have been seen in your family's home, or even just the region that they lived. Did they have a focus in that region, a certain style that was coming out at that time? Then buy something from that country in that era that you adore, and it doesn't have to be anything huge. It doesn't have to be a big financial commitment, because there are certainly antiques that are very expensive, but you can even just get a small object or something that isn't that expensive. It doesn't have to be in the most perfect condition. Sometimes that wear and tear and that patina is what makes it interesting. You will have so much more appreciation for it because you've learned something about your heritage, and now that is evident in your home. You can now share that story, whether it's a reminder to yourself about your family, or it's a story that you share with guests and family and friends that come over. You may be someone who can appreciate how older things look when you see them in a nicely designed room. You probably like the thought of having it in your home. And there may even be certain styles that you naturally gravitate to, or certain patinas that you like, or certain ages of furniture. So let's chat about what classifies something as an antique versus vintage, because knowing this classification may even help you narrow the field a little bit and give you some direction. So a lot of things can fall under the category of antiques. It can be art, furniture, or any decorative object. But the main way to know if something is a true antique is its age. Nothing can be classified as an antique if it's not at least 100 years old. So this is even true if you're buying something and bringing it into another country. There's custom laws. And the classification is important because if it's 100 years or older, then they might look at it differently in terms of customs. And even though I do not specialize in customs, I just thought this was a fun piece of information. So yeah, a piece or an object would have to be a minimum of 100 years old in order to call it an antique. And with vintage items can also be anything from decorative objects to furniture and art, but they're not as precious as antiques. So they may be a little more user-friendly, and you may not feel like you have to be as careful with them because they're just not as old. So yeah, a vintage piece, you'd start describing it with the era. So you may say it's vintage 70s or vintage 50s. And often when buying or identifying a vintage piece, it is sort of like the best from that specific era in terms of how many were produced and the quality of it. So vintage is typically 20 years or older. And just one quick little thing, just because you probably heard this term, but retro, we're not going to get into retro too much today, but typically retro is a reproduction. That's where the word retro comes from. So it's a remake of something popular from the past. So a lot of styles you might see at popular stores would be classified as retro pieces. So like a Danish modern sofa, for example. These sorts of pieces just kind of give a little nod to the past, but they don't actually come from the past. And be cautious too to not get caught up in the style that you overlook the quality, because typically mass-produced goods now, do not stand up to the quality from the past. So if you're buying something, a retro piece, it's new, but it looks like something vintage or antique, then you might want to consider, if quality is really important to you, you might want to consider actually finding a similar piece that's true vintage or a true antique. So I want to share some tips on using vintage and antique pieces. But before I get into some tips, I want to say I really want you to consider layering. Adding antique and vintage is really about adding that layer to a room. I'm sure you've heard the term layering before, but what this means is, using elements like texture and pattern and shapes and materials and lighting, accessories and artwork, and sort of layering them in ways that really complement them as individual objects and collectively. So when I talk about contrast here, and when I say to juxtapose objects, what it means is it's sort of like layering in antiques and vintage aspects that complement the room as a whole. You have to pay attention, of course, to the architecture. If the architecture is more traditional, then this style can accommodate more traditional pieces. When I say more, I mean in terms of quantity. But if you're looking for that contrast, then in a case like this, it may be best to tone down the amount of antiques and juxtapose them with really more modern pieces to highlight the age of the other pieces. So unless you're wanting a really traditional aesthetic, but today I'm focusing in this episode on adding that piece for impact and the story and the benefits, as I mentioned earlier. So in this case, it really is about choosing where you can draw that interest and get that contrast juxtaposed to the other elements, to the architecture and style that doesn't share the same age. Okay, so now I want to share some tips on, where you can find, or where you can add in a vintage or antique piece to your spaces, where it works, how to do it, and some little, just trying to get your juices flowing a bit. So, but before I get into tips, I want to just say that it's really all about layering. Adding antique and vintage is really adding that layer to a room. And I'm sure you've heard the term layering before, but the term really means using elements like texture and shapes and patterns and materials, accessories and lighting, artwork, and layering them in ways that complement one another. So when I talk about contrast here, it really means layering in antiques and vintage aspects that complement the room, they complement each other as a whole. So you have to pay attention, of course, to the architecture. If the architecture is more traditional, then this style can accommodate more traditional pieces. And when I say more, I mean in terms of quantity. But if you're looking for that contrast, then in a case like this, it may be best to tone down the amount of antiques and juxtapose them with more modern pieces to highlight the age of the antique piece, the vintage piece. So unless you're wanting, of course, a really traditional aesthetic, but today in this episode, I'm really focusing on adding that piece for impact and the story and the benefits that I mentioned earlier. So in this case, it's really about choosing where you can draw that interest and get that contrast juxtaposed to the architecture and the style that doesn't share the same age. Okay, so I'm going to run through about 5 tips with you. So the first one is to find a statement piece. This can be size or placement, so where you put it. So if it's a piece of furniture, then the size of it is what really makes it a statement. And the type of furniture you can use to do this could be, a large cabinet or a bookcase, a desk under a window, even a dining table. And if you're using, say, something like a large cabinet, then it really makes a statement, of course, the size, but it's just, you get to really see the patina. You get to see the age. When it's large, it really grounds a space. So your eyes are drawn to it, and the space can feel weighty and dramatic. And then, of course, it's what you put on it, or if it's a bookcase, what are you accessorizing in that bookcase? And this is a great way to pull that contrast where you're starting to layer in things that might be really modern. So on a cabinet, you might decide to add a really modern piece of art above it, or even if it's resting on it. Vases, oversized plants, lamps, you want to start thinking about really layering in those pieces that are going to create that contrast. And then the other great way is to use your focal points, because a focal point is an area that your eye or a place that your eye is drawn in a room. And when you utilize those focal points, immediately it can act as a statement. So if you have a wall that your eye is drawn to, as soon as you walk into your room, consider putting a piece of art there or a small table at that wall. So just really, really utilizing those focal points. And you got to realize too that a focal point isn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be large. Okay. So this is where I know the first one I said, to find a statement piece, it can be size or placement. And that's what I mean when you can buy a large piece of furniture, or you're just placing something intentionally so that your eye is drawn to it. And that has nothing to do with size. So that's my first tip. Find a statement piece. Tip number 2 is to play with arrangements. So get creative with collections. There are so many vintage and antique little collectibles. So if you're perusing an antique market or a shop, and you see a small collection that you can display, like vases or little boxes, clocks even. You can collect some really interesting vintage clocks and put them on an arrangement on your wall. Old books, that's always an interesting thing to have. If you have a hobby that you enjoy, perhaps you can find some antique books that are about that hobby. These would be things that you can arrange either on a wall or a table, a shelf, to add interest to the room. But always be intentional. So don't go crazy with a ton of really small collections or a few different collections here and there, because you don't want to overwhelm the space, right? If the space is overwhelmed, you will be too. So if this is something that interests you and you could see yourself introducing an antique or vintage using a collection, then maybe just find one collection that you're into, or that you think the arrangement of it would look really nice. And tip number 3 is, art. Vintage and antique art. That's always such an amazing way to add this layer into the room. You can frame a vintage poster. Or if you stumble across a lovely oil painting, it's just immediately you see its age. So even if you don't want, say, an oil painting, you could look at even purchasing an antique frame and then put a really modern piece of art into it. So you can play with that, either have the art that's old or have the frame that's old. You can do both for sure. But yeah, that's definitely one way I would say is a great way to introduce antiques or vintage into your space. Art, I think, is something that you don't have to worry about. It really comes down to if you're drawn to it and if you love it, put it in your space, and then you never know. That piece could inform the rest of your choices. So you could start pulling colors from that piece, textures from that piece, so that's always an important thing to consider as well. Okay, so the next tip, I think this is tip number 4, is to think about your kitchen and your bathroom as rooms that you can bring in some old goodies. we don't look at kitchens and bathrooms often as areas that you can introduce warm elements. They're typically hard surfaces. So to add something into that space that's old and that has a story and that has a patina, this is one of my favorite places to add antiques. So how can you do this in a kitchen or a bathroom? So I would say in a bathroom, you could add an antique mirror. Their frames are often ornate and lovely. So that's a perfect place. If you've got a powder room, that's just a fun place to do that. You can also add in a kitchen, say a cabinet. So if you want to store extra kitchenware, an antique cabinet is a great place to do that. Even an island, you can get these large like baker's table. They act amazing as islands. In a bathroom, you can also convert an antique cabinet into a bathroom vanity. Consider just displaying some vintage kitchenware on a shelf in your kitchen. If you don't have the ability to add something large like a kitchen island or a cabinet, even something as simple as an antique vase on your island. That's an easy way to do it. And consider your lighting as well. There is amazing vintage and antique lighting out there, and oftentimes they've been rewired, so they're up to code and all of that. If they haven't been, like if you're truly finding it at an antique market or something, then you can bring it to an electrician and they can update the wiring for you. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so the last tip number 5, is reupholstering. Reupholstering vintage and antique pieces is a great way to add interest into your space, because you can take a very old looking piece and add a lovely new modern fabric to it. And right there, you have that layering and you have that contrast that I talked about. But one of the things I will say is that when you are considering doing this, you have to make sure that the piece itself is in really good condition. So the construction of the piece is worth it, and it warrants having it reupholstered, because reupholstering is not it's not an inexpensive undertaking. It's something that sometimes it can actually cost you the same as what it would cost you to buy a piece of furniture, a similar piece of furniture, brand new. So it has to make sense for you. But if it's the look that you want, it's the dimensions that you want, it has the interest and the patina that you're after, then definitely look at reupholstering. So you can reupholster an old antique chair that's got a wood frame to it. You can reupholster a sofa. You might not have the patina in a sofa, obviously, but you're getting the shape and the scale. This is really, can be really interesting, but something like a sofa, oftentimes that's going to be a very expensive undertaking. But the first thing that I would suggest before you consider reupholstering anything is to send it to an upholsterer or take it to an upholsterer and have them weigh in on whether the construction is good and sound and if it warrants reupholstery. Because there are times where an upholsterer might just say, you know what, it's not worth it. That's happened to me before. Like it was going to cost however much to reupholster it. And they're like, no, you know what? This piece just doesn't have it. It actually would need a lot of work inside to get it to the point of, what you want. So you have to just be wary of that. But, a great place to do that is with side chairs, little reading chairs, to have those reupholstered in a fun, fresh fabric. You can even, depending on the age, have the wood painted out to something really fun. So you've still got the shape and the detail, but you've got a fresh new coat of paint on it. Of course, with that, you want to be wary of, again, the age of the piece. You don't want to do anything to devalue a piece. And oftentimes having that original wood or that original finish is what's going to give you that patina and that special something. So yes, reupholstering, I would definitely say, is a great way to add vintage and antique pieces with a fresh take. So I leave you with this today. Antiques and vintage can level up any room. They can add interest by offsetting the ordinary to make something extraordinary. They add a layer of importance and style. They can benefit your health and happiness and provide timeless quality shared through timeless stories. Thank you for listening to today's episode.